From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today, we learn how gender-affirming care for transgender youth faces an uncertain future under the Trump administration. Then our Thin Ice series explores how snowshoe hares are affected by warming winters.
As winter progressed and snow disappeared, these snowshoe hares, which turn white in the winter, were still white against a brown background because the snow was no longer present.
Plus, we'll meet Milwaukee Recreation's new director.
My goal and our goal of our department is to have healthy neighborhoods one at a time. A healthy Milwaukee is a healthy environment for all of us, for our schools, for our county. I just wanted to be a part of that so bad.
All that's coming up on Lake Effect, but first, here are today's headlines. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Thanks for joining us. One of President Trump's first executive orders was to cut federal funding for hospitals providing gender-affirming care. That order was temporarily blocked by a federal judge, but it's already impacted not just healthcare providers, but also families here in Wisconsin. Phoebe Petrovic is a reporter at Wisconsin Watch who wrote a story about a local hospital refusing gender-affirming care to one of its patients in the wake of the Trump order. While Children's Wisconsin eventually changed course and rescheduled the appointment, the future of care for transgender kids in Wisconsin is uncertain. WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez talked with Petrovic about her reporting.
I think just to set the table a little bit, when we talk about gender-affirming care, what are we specifically talking about?
So gender-affirming care is a combination of sort of social supports, therapy, medical interventions that help a person live as their gender identity rather than the sex they were assigned at birth. It means different things for different people, and there isn't necessarily one specific way that it looks. But for young people, little kids, gender-affirming care can look like getting a haircut, changing your clothes, changing your pronouns, and maybe seeing a gender clinic to talk to a provider about what medical interventions might look like in the future, and also how to support your child who is questioning their gender. It also might look like therapy, either with a provider who specifically has expertise in gender diverse youth or not. And as kids get older and they get closer to puberty, it might look like taking puberty blockers that can delay the puberty that is sort of programmed in a person's body from birth so that they have a little bit more time to decide if they want to proceed down other paths. There's also a component of surgery that though we know that it's a minority of the trans population, actually pursue, and that might look like top surgery or bottom surgery, again, to undertake steps to make your physical outside appearance align with your gender identity.
It sounds like a lot of different options based on age and what kind of is appropriate for those demographics or those individuals. How common, when you're talking about the teen procedures or therapies, how common are those with minors?
First of all, just overall, transgender people and transgender minors take up a tiny fraction of the population. So a little over 1% of the population in the United States identifies as transgender. So it's a tiny group of people. And one other thing that's really important to note is that gender-affirming care is considered best practice standard of care, the only evidence-based treatment for gender dysphoria in the country, and it is endorsed by every single major medical association and professional medical organization in the country.
We are talking right now because of a family that you profiled that really kind of had gone on this long journey seeking care, and they had an appointment set with Children's Hospital here in Milwaukee. Can you tell me about the process that they went through a little bit and then what ended up happening with that appointment and what the appointment even was that they were looking to get for their child?
So I spoke with a mother named Sarah Moscones, and she has a 13-year-old daughter who's a transgender girl, and this little girl has been identifying as a girl since she was very little. The mom told me that she remembers the little girl at 3 years old saying, "Well, I don't know why everyone thinks I'm a boy when I'm clearly a princess." And she has been consistently, persistently, insistently saying, "I am a girl." So she's been seeing a therapist who specializes in supporting transgender youth for, I want to say, 7 years, since she was 5 or 6. And then she's been a patient at Children's Wisconsin, which is gender clinic, for about 4.5 years. First, that was just talking and seeing what might be out there. This little girl has been on blockers, puberty blockers, for quite some time, and she had gone through the process with her family to request and get approved for starting hormone replacement therapy. So moving off of the blocker and starting to go through puberty that aligns with her gender identity. This is something that actually requires the hospital's approval from a higher board. It's not just the doctor saying, "Okay, we're good to go." It requires a higher level of scrutiny and approval. That process had happened, and Sarah, the mom that I spoke to, had gotten a notification on New Year's Eve, actually, that we're ready to go. We're going to set up another appointment where we get informed consent from both parents to proceed with this. We're also going to get some blood work. So they were all set and ready to go for that consent appointment. And right before then, a couple days before, got a phone call that actually the hospital had reversed course and they were going to cancel the appointment and not let her daughter proceed on to gender-affirming hormone therapy. And this mom was devastated and had to break the news to her 13-year-old. And the 13-year-old told her mom, "I'm upset by this, but I also was sort of expecting this. I had been expecting this since the election happened." So I spoke with that mom, Sarah, late on Wednesday night. We wrote that story up the next day, tried to get a response from Children's Wisconsin, didn't get a response. Ran with the story anyway because we had heard that other people were also trying to contact Children's and hadn't heard back. And by the next morning, the mom got a call that the hospital had actually reversed course and was reinstating or rescheduling that appointment for that young girl. And she had an appointment that afternoon.
Why did the hospital end up calling the family back? What happened there?
We don't know. I have been trying to get on the phone or to receive an email response from the press team at Children's. I have paged them untold number of times. I've even contacted the press person on LinkedIn and Facebook, and they have not said anything publicly, as far as I know, have not said anything to me. What we do know is in between that time, I published a story breaking the news that this family had their care canceled, and also two other news outlets followed up and reported similar findings. And so there were 3 stories out there saying that Children's had done this sort of in quiet. And after that, they called this parent back and they were able to schedule the appointment and resume with the care. So we're still sort of waiting to find out and see what Children's says. One thing that's important to note is that this executive order doesn't have the force of law, and it can't compel hospitals to take a particular action. It can't compel hospitals to stop providing gender-affirming care. What it can do is create a culture of fear and a chilling effect and a concern that they might eventually lose their federal funding because they continue to provide this care. And so that's something that ultimately has to be challenged or litigated. And some hospitals around the country, including Children's Wisconsin, appear to have taken a sort of risk-averse approach, saying, "You know what, we don't want to lose our funding, we're just going to stop this." And some of them have also reversed course in response to public pressure or protest, and others are holding firm.
With this kind of executive order in the air and maybe the risk-averse nature of the one of two facilities that provide this sort of care here in Wisconsin, what can we expect, or what do we know we could expect from healthcare providers, hospitals, and doctors going forward in the state?
Yeah, so I have heard from trans people in Wisconsin who are adults, who said that their providers have expressed to them, "We're here for you. We're going to continue providing this care." But ultimately, as we've seen from the fall of Roe and reversal of abortion rights, coming up in conflict with this federal law that requires hospitals to provide life-saving care if needed, and still women are dying of miscarriages and needing abortion care. Like it's all kind of messy, and the duty to provide care and the desire to provide care can run up against threat of prosecution or criminal investigation or losing funding. And so it really is a sort of on reporters like myself and the public to keep asking the medical providers in the state how they're going to respond to this moment, if they're going to keep treating trans kids. I did mention that we don't know whether or not Children's is accepting new patients, whether their sort of compromise for the Trump executive order is to say, well, we'll keep serving our current patients, but we won't take any more on. That's unclear, but what Sarah, the mom, told me, and what many other transgender activists or LGBTQ allies have said, is that they're not going to stop fighting, and that they're going to make sure that this care remains accessible to all who want it and need it, not just the lucky few who happen to be enrolled in treatment at this time.
Okay, so you've covered this topic for years across the state, or at least have talked to people who have been in this situation, like Sarah and her daughter. And so much of the talk is on policy and less really on the people, right? Like what does this mean for the courts? What does this mean for federal funding? But what effect does this all have on trans youth? Delayed affirming treatment, this misinformation and disinformation campaign being the targets of like a legislative machine, all to an already incredibly vulnerable group of people. What impact does this have?
We know that it can be incredibly devastating, detrimental to young trans people, mental health, and their physical health. We know from research that the mere introduction of a bill seeking to ban gender-affirming care for trans youth has a detrimental effect on this population's mental health and can lead to things like increased risk of suicide attempts and self-harm. Sarah told me that her young daughter cried to her saying, I don't want to grow a beard. I don't want to develop in the way that my older brother is developing in puberty. I don't want to go through with this. And that her mental health was in a really poor state before she was getting gender-affirming care. And being able to live as herself has allowed her to flourish. I've spoken with an untold number of trans people across Wisconsin, young people and adults, who say that being able to live as their authentic selves, being able to access this life-saving medication and treatment that is life-saving and life-affirming makes all the difference. And these sustained attacks really, really impact their mental health, their well-being, and also, are contrary to the scientific or medical consensus about what good care is.
Phoebe Petrovic is a reporter at Wisconsin Watch. She spoke with WUWM's Jimmy Gutierrez. Wisconsin's winters are warming. Last winter marked the warmest since 1895. WUWM series Thin Ice 2025, Wisconsin's Warming Winters, explores these changes and the impact on the state's agriculture and inhabitants. UW-Madison researchers Benjamin Zuckerberg and Jonathan Pauly have been studying snowshoe hares for more than a decade. It's a species that depends on snow to ward off predators. Their fur turns white in the winter, blending in with snow cover, and is brown the rest of the year. As part of our Thin Ice series, Zuckerberg and Pauly joined WUWM's environmental reporter Susan Bentz to share what they're learning about the impacts of warming winters on snowshoe hares. They're building on research dating back to 1945, when ecologist Aldo Leopold published the first anecdotal data on snowshoe hares here in Wisconsin.
So back in the Leopold days, they were saying they thought that half of the state, the upper half of the state, they were present?
I would say roughly half. He went out and he came up with known presence of snowshoe hares, and then he kind of plotted them on a map, and then he kind of, crudely drew what that range boundary was for snowshoe hare. And And that was roughly half the state, I would say. But then it wasn't until, late 70s, early 80s? Am I getting these years right?
Is that correct? Yeah.
Okay, late 70s, early 80s, when Lloyd Keith and Dave Buehler went back. There was kind of a range contraction, but it was kind of like variable. Like some places seemed to retreat northward, other places seemed to kind of stay the same, and even like some small expansions. But it was really hard to disentangle how much of that was actual range shifts, because they were comparing it to a relatively kind of qualitative approach from Leopold.
And I think one of the more interesting aspects of this is that we kind of found that back in the 70s and 80s, before some of the biggest changes have been occurring in terms of snow cover and changes in winter, was that the main thing that constrained where snowshoe hares were in the state was forest fragmentation, sort of where forest was in terms of the extent of that forest cover. And now, when we look at sort of where they've been retracting from between the late 70s to now, that those areas that where they were retracting from are more likely to retract from were areas where we've seen some of the biggest changes in terms of snow cover, in particular, the loss of snow cover over the last 30 to 40 years. And that clearly became the more dominant environmental change, which was this loss or warming of the winters and the loss of snow cover.
That then led to like a series of other projects where we did do things like capturing animals, relocating animals, tracking their fates.
So when you say relocating, you're trying to save the guys?
Other states have actually done that to try and restore snowshoe hare populations that have since been regionally extirpated. The real goal of that project, though, we've worked for a long time in a place called Sandhill Wildlife Area. And Sandhill is at the center of the state. Sandhill is right by a town called Babcock. Babcock is the last, in Wisconsin, the last town that a wild passenger pigeon was shot. So that's kind of a familiar, maybe, marker for people.
Sad but true.
Yep, sad but true marker for our state. Now, the location of Babcock and Sandhill Wildlife Area is really interesting. It actually falls along what's called the transition zone. So when you're in southern Wisconsin, there are habitats that are dominated by oak savannas and prairie. And as many Wisconsinites know, as you move further north, that begins to turn over into forested landscapes, mixed conifer deciduous, and then as you get further and further north, more coniferous dominated forests. At that place, historically, Lloyd Keith actually saw that population going extinct. I forget the exact year, I want to say like 91, 92, somewhere around there, early 90s. He began to document these populations kind of vanishing. So this was kind of the forefront of this range contraction that we were just talking about. Now, if you go further north of there, not that far north, you will still see snowshoe hare populations present day. Now, the question that we had was, if we were to translocate snowshoe hares from just north of Sandhill, where they still persist, to Sandhill, where they historically persisted, could they hold on? And to that end, what was the main cause of that population locally going extinct? And more broadly then, what's the principal driver behind that range contraction that we observed with that student, Sean Saltaire? So another graduate student, his name is Evan Wilson, he went up and he trapped 100 snowshoe hares, and we brought them down to Sandhill, and we released them. And what we found was that actually after the initial release, we did this in winter, after the initial release, snowshoe hares actually did quite well. They persisted for a little while. But as winter progressed and snow disappeared, these snowshoe hares, which turn white in the winter, were still white against a brown background because the snow was no longer present. And that was the major source of their mortality, was that they were highly vulnerable to predation because they're white snowshoe hares on a brown background. So they're mismatched. Their camouflage is now mismatched with the environment in which they occur. And so that's, in my opinion, really strong evidence to show this linkage between climate change, shortening winter seasons, which we have observed, and then the loss of winter specialists like snowshoe hares.
There's other species, porcupines, for example, they do better when the hares are there.
Precisely. That was also part of that project. And I have to give full credit to Ben. He called this project, which I fully embraced, Ecological Time Machine. The idea being, if we relocated snowshoe hares to Sandhill, could we resurrect historical community dynamics? Because just as you put, these species don't occur in a vacuum, right? They interact with one another, either directly or indirectly. We've been studying porcupines at Sandhill for many years now. And one thing that we observed is that porcupine populations at Sandhill aren't producing a lot of young. These adults are still living for a long time, and that makes sense.
They're armed.
They're armed,
Yeah.
they're protected, so they're kind of hard to kill. But baby porcupines, called porcupets, are really vulnerable, right? Their quills haven't hardened, they're not as well protected. There's not a lot of maternal investment in porcupets. We're not seeing a lot of porcupets coming into the population. And so our question was, well, why could that be? What's the mechanism behind it? And our hypothesis was that snowshoe hares, by being present on the landscape, are a more preferred food item. And therefore, they might be buffering even those really vulnerable porcupets from predation. And the timing of it's all really kind of cool, too, because when snowshoe hares are typically most mismatched with their environment, white hares on brown backgrounds, when they're most vulnerable to being eaten, is also right around the time porcupets are being born. So we were wondering, could there be like a buffering effect of snowshoe hares, these Snicker bars running around the woods that are really vulnerable and really tasty, that's kind of diverting predation away from porcupets. And so what we found after we released all those snowshoe hares and after we lost snow is that porcupets survived better. So we had evidence then to suggest that there is this indirect effect of snowshoe hares being present on the landscape, what ecologists call an apparent mutualism, that actually benefits another species, porcupines, indirectly by diverting predation away from the porcupets to themselves, which is pretty cool. So then it really kind of begins to what you're talking about, get at this idea of how do communities then operate? That we talk a lot about losing species from climate change. I think one of the biggest consequences of that is not simply the loss of a species, it's the loss of really interesting and important ecological interactions. But one of the really important outcomes of it was actually identifying management that could be utilized to help mitigate that effect. What I mean by that is, if a snowshoe hare is white, but it's brown out because of climate change, it's brown out because we lost our snow, their risk of dying, if they're in a patch of alder and aspen, that risk is actually the same as if they were matched with their background. And so that means that we could actually begin to envision management strategies, create forests or manage our forests in a way that can offset the costs of climate change, at least for that species. This is what we've done forever, manage habitat. We're really good at this. Managing climate change, we're not so good at, but managing habitat, we're quite good at. And so through that work, Ben and I and our graduate students have been able to identify forest types and composition that actually could be promoted to then reduce what that risk of climate change is to something like the snowshoe hare. And that's actionable.
Yeah. I mean, I think when we look at the suite of species that we think are going to be vulnerable, it does come down to some of these decisions. Do we understand the ecology and mechanisms by which climate change may impact these species? Do we have long-term data by which we can revisit? Because we know climate change is a process that takes decades to manifest. And does it have importance in a managerial sense and in terms of society? I mean, we are an applied department. We think about applied questions, and what we do in terms of research can help inform society and decisions. And so there's really only a handful of species that meet those criteria.
Benjamin Zuckerberg and Jonathan Pauly are professors at UW-Madison in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. They both study snowshoe hare populations in the state and spoke with WUWM's Susan Bentz for our Thin Ice series. Stay tuned for more of that reporting throughout the week. Did you know you can listen to Lake Effect as a podcast? Just search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcast to download and listen on demand. The man who owned Oriental Drugs on Milwaukee's east side before it closed in the 90s has passed away.
I sat down with him, and his only concern, to illustrate what a kind-hearted, generous man he was he said, "I just don't want my customers to be uncomfortable." At a time in his life that was probably one of the most difficult passages for him and his family and the employees who he treated like family.
We'll learn about him and the beloved drugstore that was a staple for many Milwaukeeans for decades later in the show. But first, we'll meet the new director of Milwaukee Recreation. Keep listening to Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Milwaukee Public Schools recently approved Brian Litzy as the new Senior Director of Milwaukee Recreation. Milwaukee Rec runs hundreds of programs in the city, from after-school care to youth sports and cooking classes. Litzy has been with Milwaukee Rec since 2002 and has worked in various leadership roles within the department over the years. Lake Effect's Excret Nunez spoke with Litzy about his goals and priorities in this new role.
Just last month, you stepped into the role as the director of Milwaukee Recreation, but you've been with the department for a number of years, most recently as assistant director and manager of operations. Why did you decide to take on this new role?
I took it on because I felt like I was ready, and I felt like I can serve the community. And I felt like I can give my absolute all to the people of Milwaukee, Milwaukee Public Schools, and all the neighborhoods adjoining Milwaukee. I think I've been prepared for this for 23 years of working for Milwaukee Recreation. So it's given me a unique vantage point of the city, the inner workings of recreation, MPS, and I just think of the connections that I've made. And I want to make those collaborations even stronger because my goal and our goal of our department is to have healthy neighborhoods one at a time. A healthy Milwaukee is a healthy environment for all of us, for our schools, for our county. I just wanted to be a part of that so bad.
And as you mentioned, you began your career with Milwaukee Recreation in 2002.
Correct.
How did you first get interested and involved in public recreation?
Sure. Yeah, good question. I've been in college for a long time. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but one of my counselors just said, "Hey, what do you want to do?" And I was like, "I love sports. That's all I've been doing all my life as a kid and things like that." And they were like, "You want to be a PE teacher?" I was like, "I don't know about that. How about recreation?" And I took my first rec class and I was hooked. I didn't know you could do that, and I didn't know what that experience was like. But once I started taking classes, I was like, I found my place, my village, I think.
Wow. And can you tell me a little bit about the positions that you've had during your time at Milwaukee Rec?
Sure. I started off as what we used to call assistant supervisor for after-school programs. So I worked in our community learning centers, better known as CLCs. So for years, I was assistant supervisor, moved my way up to supervisor, then a manager, and then a coordinator. So at some point, I oversaw all of the after-school programs within Milwaukee Public Schools. So that was over 80 or 90 programs at one time. So it gave, again, those experience. And after-school space for me at that time when I was doing that, it made me feel like I would hear parents say, we couldn't work without this program. And having our kids somewhere safe and where they have good adults and loving adults in front of them makes them go to work, just feel good about being able to do that and come and get their kids. And sometimes kids don't want to go home because they were having so much fun. And that was like my first 10 years or 11 years of my career. And then after that, I moved up to manager of operations, assistant director, where I focused more on the operations, right? So making sure that we were funded well enough to do these programs. And then I started really working with my former director, Lynn Grebb, with our revitalization program of our 52 playfields, which has been a huge success, right? I think Lynn and I both have the philosophy of that recreation is a right. Like people should have good, clean spaces to recreate and be outside and have all those amenities that other places have. So we devised a plan based on equity, and we put together teams to do this. And we have about 12 or 13 that we've done. And the plan is to have all of them done at some point. You know, I may not be here to see it, but the work will live on because we've done some great planning. And just to see neighborhoods revitalized, not just the space, but neighborhoods because of what's been done there, it's great. And that's why I kind of came up with the theme of like one neighborhood at a time, right? Like until we get a total, healthy Milwaukee. And I've loved it because I've got a chance to work with the city, county partners and partners in our neighborhood. It's just been a great experience over those now 23 years to work in all those different areas.
What is it about Milwaukee Recreation that's made you want to stick around for so long?
Sure. It's been great because I'm not a native Milwaukeean. I'm from Chicago originally, and I lived in Chicago mostly all my life, except for, college stints. And it was just the people. The job is great. I love what I do, but it's the people that I work with, my colleagues, and the people that I've met in the community, the kids, adults, and everybody that I've had a chance to interact with over my years has just made me love it, right? I heard stories when I first moved here as a 29, 30-year-old person, of how much recreation played a part in the lives of Milwaukeeans, right? Like the playgrounds and the memories that they had. And then as I came up in the department, I would see kids that were in our after-school programs years later, and they wouldn't talk about their math class or anything like that. They would talk about the experiences when we took them somewhere or when they had a chance to do something. So making those lasting memories has been, for me, like one of the best things I can ever do in my life as part of this position or job per se.
That's amazing. Yeah, so like you mentioned, there are so many aspects of Milwaukee Recreation that your career has touched on. On top of the hundreds of educational and recreational programs Milwaukee Rec offers, the department also oversees the 52 playfields, youth sports, the playfield renovation project. I know you just started a few weeks ago, but how are you approaching the first few months of this new role?
A little different because, right, I've been embedded in Milwaukee, so I'm not coming in fresh, right?
Right.
I have a different set of eyes than the former director, Lynn Grebb, of course, but my thing is that I've come into it making some challenges to myself and to my team. And one of those challenges is that, we love our social media presence, right? Like we've grown so much with that. But what I really want our team to do and myself to do is get back out into the community and meet people face to face, make those partnerships with our neighborhood associations, with our faith-based communities, really walk the neighborhoods to see what the kids and the families are doing and make those real deep-rooted connections with a handshake and a smile.
And so, on top of that, are there any major projects or goals you're looking forward to accomplishing?
Yeah, definitely our playfields, definitely we want to keep doing that. We also have a community center that we're working on, and hopefully that will be 2027, I believe. That'll be up, and I think that'll be a great boost to the community on 76 in Silver Spring. So it'll be the first one that we've ever had where we took an existing school building that was no longer being used, and we're making it into a full-scale community center with a pool, gym, meeting spaces, and things like that. So that'll be a huge challenge for our team. And I want us to be innovative, right? I want us to think about new and vibrant programs and ideas that we can offer to the community, and with the help of the community to kind of let us know where we're missing and what things we can be doing that are new and fresh for them. So that's
Yeah.
another challenge that I have for myself and my team. And I just think sustainability, right? Having quality service. When you call us, we should be able to fix your problem. Like, if there's an issue, let us try to help you, right? And that's what all of my staff, that's the goal of my staff, is to be able to, when that person hangs up that phone or that email, they said, yeah, they got great customer service from us. So.
as we've talked about, Milwaukee has several neighborhoods with their own unique needs and values. How will you make sure to continue connecting and serving so many different communities?
Yeah, I think again, we have to have a presence, right? We have to show our faces, right? When you see that blue shirt, whether that's a part-time person or that's a full-time person, we have to be approachable and we have to be able to approach the community, right? Like, so welcoming, events and things like that to welcome, the neighborhood to show like, hey, these spaces are yours, right? They don't belong to us per se, they're yours. And just keep making those connections day by day, right? It doesn't happen overnight. And people have to trust you, right? There's, different neighborhoods have their own different cultures and things like that. But I think we have to be embedded in those cultures as well to have the neighborhood trust. And along with, we can't do it by ourselves. So I love working with our, local aldermen, local county supervisors, local school officials and things like that. So I think it's a group effort, and that's how I hope, we can kind of take one neighborhood at a time and build those real lasting relationships.
Right. Well, before we wrap up, I want to ask you, how do you envision the future of Milwaukee Recreation?
The future of Milwaukee Recreation, I envision it as strong and vibrant, having collaborations and input from our neighborhoods and our community leaders and anybody in the community that uses our facilities and wants to use our facilities have a say in what's going on in their play field or in their community center. And we have open and vibrant spaces for everybody to use, and it's safe. Again, healthy neighborhoods means healthy schools, means healthy ecosystem. It all kind of trickles down, and that's how I see Milwaukee Rec playing its part in the whole system of Milwaukee.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I really appreciate your time, and I'm excited to see Milwaukee Rec out there.
Again, we can't thank you enough. And anytime you want to have us and talk about programs or anything else, please let us know. We'll be here.
Brian Litzy is Milwaukee Recreation's new director, and he spoke with Lake Effect's Excrit Nunez. He's the department's 11th director in its 114-year history. A new season of Bubbler Talk is on the way, and we need some new questions. Submit your questions about the Milwaukee area at wuwm.com. We'll take one more break and then revisit the story of Milwaukee's Oriental Drugs. That's next on Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR.
Ella se fue.
This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Oriental Drugs operated at the corner of Farwell and North Avenue in Milwaukee next to the Oriental Theater from 1929 until 1995. It was a diner, drugstore, and hardware store. The longtime owner and pharmacist, Hy Eglosh, passed away last week. His daughter posted on Facebook that he died from a stroke at age 92. Artist and filmmaker Brooke Maroldi produced a documentary to capture the essence of Oriental Drugs before it was driven out of business by national drugstore chains. WUWM's Mayan Silver spoke to Maroldi about the documentary back in 2022.
When I moved to Milwaukee in 1992, everybody told me, go to Oriental Drugs. I stepped into that place, took it all in, and said, if Milwaukee can support a place like this is the place I can live. And so it was a couple years of being a customer. I mean, I wasn't an everyday customer. Like some people, you'll see in the documentary, were there breakfast, lunch, and dinner. People met their future spouses there. It was a way of life for many people, a real community center. Me, I was more on the fringe, but when I saw on the news that it was closing, it was like somebody had died. It really hit all of us. And I remember just calling all these different people I knew, and everybody was talking about it. And I said, well, God, somebody should do a documentary about this. And I didn't see anybody doing it. And I still felt like a newcomer to Milwaukee. I was a little shy about approaching Hi Eglash, the wonderful owner. And I just thought, well, nobody's doing it. Why don't I? I had the camera. And I sat down with him, and his only concern, to illustrate what a kind-hearted, generous man he was he said, I just don't want my customers to be uncomfortable. And I assured him that I would get all the customers' permission before filming them, and that was his only concern. At a time in his life that was probably one of the most difficult passages for him and his family and the employees who he treated like family, he was kind and generous enough to let me go in every day and make the video. And that's what I did.
It's really amazing how many voices you got in there. You got, people talking, tearing up about the pharmacy closing and not having any place to, people not having any place to go, and people who would have stories about Christmas, the staff singing carols to them and stuff like that. I mean, you can get a sense of it watching your documentary, but for people who have never set foot, how would you describe the vibe at that place? Like, what comes immediately to your head?
To me, everyone was accepted there. I mean, you can have a local celebrity sitting there, sitting next to somebody who is homeless. You saw all ages, like younger people thought it was hip. Older people found it as a place to escape being all alone in their little apartments. So it served as a real community center. And it didn't have any special interests attached to that. There was no, I mean, certainly people talked about politics, but it wasn't like it is now where it was so polarized. And I think that was the most striking thing about it, was how welcoming it was to everybody. Not only that, I mean, you could buy your postal stamps, you could get hardware, pick up your prescription, sit down and get a burger, all kinds of crazy stuff there. Real plants, you name it.
There is a sociologist called Ray Oldenburg, and he talked about third places, and those are places that aren't home, they're not work, but they're like that third place that you can go where people know you and you can socialize. And I think when he wrote that theory, this was probably exactly the kind of place that he was referring to, right?
Yeah, and I don't see a lot of places like that anymore. Yeah, there's coffee shops, but a lot of them tend to be kind of trendy or high end, and they are geared toward a certain demographic. That is what I really think was unique about the place, was that it was all inclusive. Yeah.
With Oldenburg, he had like a few main principles. Conversation is the main activity. You might be eating, drinking, or doing something else, but conversation is key. There's a home away from home where you find regulars, people who sort of root there. The mood is playful, wit is prized. It's not like young or old, and there's no barrier to sort of entry. Right now, what's sitting in that spot, I don't know if it was there before you left Milwaukee, but the Crossroads Collective, it's kind of like a hip eatery food hall. How would you describe the difference between a place like that and a place like Oriental Drugs?
There's no comparison because, first of all, what's there now is all about eating, and it's all about a certain demographic that it's appealing to. with Oriental Drugs and places like it, there were so many needs met there. And one of the things that was really cool about the design of the counter was it wasn't circular. I don't know how you would describe that counter. It was like all these different U-shaped. So people were forced to look at each other. People were forced to be next to each other. And I used the word forced, but it didn't feel forced. It was very natural and open in that respect. I can't compare it to anything. And I've been traveling quite a bit. I haven't seen anything quite like that. That's new. That's been created in the last 10 or 20 years, even. And it's almost sad that a place like that couldn't get onto the National Register of Historic Places because it is part of our history. And once that's gone, it gets wiped out forever, and all you have left is older people talking about the good old days.
Do you think that the fact that we're in a technological age now, I mean, because Oriental Drugs kind of closed up right before the internet era, right? And I mean, it was even before computers were that widespread, and certainly not cell phones and all the other knickknacks and gadgets that we have now, with people staring at their screens. I mean, that just didn't happen there, right? So do you think part of it can potentially never be replicated?
You're probably right about that because even if you did have those kinds of counters where people are sitting next to each other or across from each other, would they be talking to each other or would they just be looking at their phones? I mean, I've had plenty of situations with friends I haven't seen in years, and I'm sitting across from them, and they're checking their phones. And I'm like, hello, I'm here. I haven't seen you in 3 years. Look up, look around. And that that would be a sad state if, like, a place like that did exist, but nobody's taking advantage of the potential human contact.
To what would you ascribe the magic of Oriental Drugs? Why does the Oriental Pharmacy hold such a special place in Milwaukeeans' hearts?
Well, I think it's a part of Milwaukee history, not only Milwaukee history, but American history that's gone. The whole age of a mom and pop anything, whether it's a mom and pop, clothing store. When have you been to one of those? Unless it's like a very high price boutique. Maybe that's part of it too, is the accessibility financially. I mean, Milwaukeeans are known as very fiscally responsible, shall we say? And, you could get an endless cup of coffee there for 99 cents. So there's that kind of availability financially. But, how do you put that spark into a bottle and replicate it? I don't know that you can today. And maybe that's part of it, is that no one has been able to recreate that sense of community while fulfilling real needs. People need to get their prescriptions filled. People need to get a cup of coffee or, some little radiator part bit that only an old hardware store would have. So the needs are fulfilled, but without breaking the bank. And then you have to come down to the training that is really embedded in the employees, which was friendliness, just friendliness and helpfulness. And I know at a lot of businesses, employees aren't invested in their jobs. It's just a job, and they're going to go somewhere else in 2 or 3 months. Whereas I know some of the employees, they were like little celebrities in Milwaukee. People would see them on the street. It's like, oh, you're the hardware guy at the Oriental drugstore. Hey, you're the guy who works behind the counter. And that is a little part of that magic right there. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me about this.
Oh gosh, you bet. It's nice to walk down memory lane. Long time ago.
Brooke Maroldi is an artist and filmmaker who made the documentary Death of a Corner Drugstore about Oriental drugs here in Milwaukee. She spoke with WUWM's Mayan Silver about it back in 2022. The longtime owner and pharmacist at Oriental Drugs, Hai Eglash, died last week at the age of 92. And that wraps up the show for today. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. If you've missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining us today, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.